Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer. Thanks for joining us on the first episode of our third season. Since we launched this podcast 2 years ago, the response has really been incredible. We now have listeners in all 50 U.S. states and nearly 50 other countries. When we started it, we wanted to create another way to share information and inspire listeners to try something new, to deepen their understanding and hopefully take bolder action. Our guests on the show have shared extraordinary experiences that have made us laugh and cry and cheer them on. We realize that all around us, ordinary people who make extraordinary commitments are working every day to protect communities and the planet. So as we head into season 3, we want to create a show that brings you, your concerns, ideas, and insights into the podcast. Our priority this season is to help you make sense of the political situation in the U.S. amid unprecedented changes and bring light to the impact they're having on people and communities and how people are responding. We'll continue to break down complex issues, but we're going to have a more conversational format. Our goal is to have you feel more like you're sitting down with us, getting to know me and our guests more personally. We're thinking about ways to hear from you and how to bring your questions and comments into the show, so stay tuned as we try to figure that out. To kick off our season, we sit down with 3 senior fellows here at Just Solutions to get their thoughts and insights on this moment of federal tax and rollbacks and their ideas for a path forward. Our guests have spent decades as community organizers and directors of winning campaigns advancing social and racial justice. They're deep thinkers with hands-on experience and are currently actively engaged on a number of important efforts. First is Rhawa Ghirmatzion. She lives in Buffalo, New York, and has been working locally and globally on environmental justice. Also joining us is Khanh Pham. She's a state senator from Oregon representing Portland and has a long and deep commitment to her community. And finally, Rich Stolz is joining us from Washington, D.C., as a longtime leader on immigrant rights. So welcome, Rhawa, Khanh, and Rich to the show.
Excited to be here.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
So the 3 of you represent very diverse parts of the United States. So Rich, you're in Washington, D.C., Rhawa, you're in Buffalo, New York, and Khanh, you're out in Portland, Oregon. You all sit in different places in the movement and have different backgrounds and professional experiences. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you and to really kick off our season. So I'm going to start with you, Khanh, because as we tape the show, President Trump has made it clear that he wants to send the U.S. military to Portland under the false claim that the city is rioting and, quote, burning to the ground. You're a state senator representing Portland and a longtime community organizer and mother. So how is your community doing?
Our communities are feeling the full range of emotions. I think people are incredibly scared by this totally unlawful, unconstitutional, unwelcome militarization of our city to be used as a training ground for military troops. But at the same time, I have to say, people are also discovering a sense of civic pride that we haven't felt in a while because, it's just a natural reaction to somebody describing us as war ravaged. I've just been overwhelmed by videos of our beautiful city, people at the farmers market, people roller skating, or, some of those beautiful scenes that really encapsulate some of what I love about Portland. And I think a lot of people across a wide range of political differences are coming together united and defending our city. Because no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, I think everyone realizes that this is completely uncalled for.
And Rhawa, you have really played an important role in Buffalo, New York, in bringing resources to communities with lower incomes, communities that really are disproportionately impacted by climate change. You've really been a leader in the effort to bring Inflation Reduction Act funding to Buffalo, and President Trump has cut federal grants to your community. This is funding for access to solar energy, funding for renewable energy, energy efficiency, improvements for communities facing climate change. I mean, these are things that a lot of people support. So what will be the impact to Buffalo with the loss of that federal money?
The impacts are huge. Buffalo is the 3rd poorest city in the United States. We are highly segregated, and the income inequality just continues to grow. So we have lots of vulnerable populations, in particular, a lot of our seniors and young people. Those are our largest populations. And we are also living in, climate catastrophe. Climate change is quite devastating, even though we are known as a climate haven or climate refuge. It is a refuge if you have a lot of resources. It is not a refuge if we don't deal and address like our old housing stock, if we don't address things like heat island effect, if we don't address having better ways of creating hubs that are not just heating and warming places, but oftentimes some of our people would have to walk a mile or two. And that is just not accessible for the people that need it most. The devastation of losing a lot of the federal funding is, about $30 million that was going to go specifically to low income households to get things like heat pumps, which would mean that they would have air conditioning and also warming in the winter. They would have access to reducing their energy bills by having renewable energy projects like solar. But we also lost about $20 million in community change grants. This was going to go straight to the front lines, making sure that people had what they needed to begin to think of creating resiliency where they live. And then on top of that, we lost about $250 million to the state in Solar for All grants as well. So it's pretty devastating, especially as exactly what Khan named, right? I think people are frustrated and looking for change primarily because, they want to be able to afford childcare. They want to be able to afford healthcare. They want to be able to afford their food prices. The grocery prices are just out of control, as well as dealing with higher rents and really just being able to pay everyday expenses.
Yeah, and Rhawa, it's a good reminder for everyone to understand the challenges that people are facing as it relates to climate change. Folks who have lower incomes, it is really about surviving. It's about having an opportunity to withstand those impacts of heat and cold and having the ability to have a safe place. Now, Rich, you have been a longtime leader in the immigrant rights movement, and so much of what we're seeing nationally is in response to ICE raids. When you think about the work that you're doing, which is at the intersection of climate migration and immigration, what are you witnessing in communities? What are you hearing from advocates across the country? And let's talk a little bit about the intersection between immigration and climate justice.
Politicians that benefit from fear of immigrants will use that to meet their goals. The danger to countries is not immigration, it's how you respond. And what the president is doing, I think, is an example of a worst case scenario as to what a politician might be willing to do when there is a lot of immigration. We can anticipate a future where climate change impacts are driving more and more people into decisions about whether they can stay where they live or whether they need to move. Some percentage of those folks forced to move will decide to migrate across borders. Some of them will decide to come to a place like the United States for opportunities, for safety, for protection. And when they do, we need, as a society, to be clear about what is the rule of law in that context. And the rule of law is making sure that people are able to migrate safely, that once they're there, they are able to access real due process, and that there's a system that they can trust that will work in the interests of all the stakeholders. And all of that is getting thrown out the window. Unfortunately, it's really all about power. In a couple instances, the threat of sending the National Guard has been in response to the need to support ICE in its immigration activities. There's no justification for sending the National Guard into these cities, and they're using it to basically push the boundaries of what is accepted as normal. And I think it's vitally important that people push back the way they have been in a lot of these cities.
Yeah. And this is nothing new in the U.S., right? This has been for so long a strategy used by politicians. I think it's a helpful reminder about the use of fear-mongering and the impact that that has. As we hear Rhawa and Rich talk, Khan, what are some things that you're hearing that you feel like are the common themes that run across everything that has been talked about?
The crisis of democracy is at the center of all of these crises that we're facing, whether it's the climate crisis or xenophobia and racist crackdown on immigration and immigrant communities. I think it really goes to the heart of the fact that our democratic institutions are failing us. And I think that we've really become painfully aware that so many of the democratic institutions that we kind of took for granted, like having an independent judiciary and having separation of powers and rule of law and due process rights for everybody, are just kind of so easily shattered. And I think we have to do a lot of introspection about we as a movement and as elected leaders have failed to really develop the practice and muscle building of practicing democratic leadership and building leaders at all different levels, whether they're in elected office or in community. I think all of us are starting to realize how much we can't just depend on the federal government to provide, but we really need to be building our own local and state leadership.
Yeah, there is this sense that elected leaders are the ones that are going to lead the change, and that, my opinion has never been the case historically. It is always the people who have led the change. So there's a balance, right? And I say this, and this as a state senator, right? Everybody has a role, and there's only so much that everyone can do. But in a democracy, it really is the people, it's the voters that are really going to drive that change.
I mean, I guess to put a finer point too, also, I think historically, I think our communities, a lot of environmental justice communities, have really looked to the federal government for the funding, for the programs, and I think unfortunately in this moment, we're going to have to transform and really pivot towards what does it look like to look to our own, whatever we can generate locally or at the state level, at the most at the state level, because clearly the federal government is not only coming to help us, but is actually coming to undermine and harm our communities. And so I think that's a real shift that as communities we're going to have to grapple with, because a lot of our organizing has been oriented towards the federal government. I think we should have strong federal government programs, but in this moment, it's going to require a huge mind shift. And I'd love to hear what Rhawa you think about that pivot, given what you just talked about in terms of the federal cuts.
Oh, I love, first of all, what you said. I agree with that so much is, kind of addressing the fragility of what we took for granted, whether it's, hey, we have a constitution, we have all these guardrails. So we are now learning that we don't have as many guardrails as we thought. I don't know if you guys saw the CNN presentation with Stephen Miller, and he excellently didn't mean to, but said plenary power. And then he went radio silent, acted like there was a disconnect in the feed. But I thought that was very interesting that he let that slip out, which I think is exactly what they're trying to do, is really consolidating power in ways that we've never seen. And I think that it's happening as quickly as it is because people did come with a plan. They have an amazing strategy to consolidate power as much as they can. And I think the other thing is the technology, right? We are living at a time when we need to really be regulating all the different technologies that are out there that are actually making this consolidation of power go faster. And I'm a very hopeful person. And I really think that in some ways it is creating a situation with the movement to kind of get real with themselves and say, how do we have that mind shift? I love what Oregon is doing with all of the cultural workers that are like, oh my God, let us show you how Portland is burning down. Oh, maybe if I go to another neighborhood, oh, maybe you know what? And so maybe it's the matcha tea. I love that, right? As a way to kind of really mirror back the absurdity of what is happening, but as a way to begin like the cultural narrative work that needs to happen, the sort of mindset shift. And then I think the other thing is, you're right, like the federal government is not coming to help us. And we really need to work with our state agencies and government partners there. Municipalities, whether that's at the county level or at the city level, we have to come into tighter formation because we actually have no choice, because these federal cuts will have an impact for everyday people really soon.
And that's part of the purpose of the show is like, we have experienced a complete turnaround. Rhawa, not that long ago, you were planning for all this money and investing in community, and it was very hopeful. And there's just this complete turnaround. What were we missing? How did this happen? We wrote a paper defending and advancing climate justice and really looked deeply at what might happen. But what were we missing that we have gotten to this place?
I think we could devote months and weeks to discuss this. And I
kind of think we should. Don't you think we kind of should, though?
We absolutely should. There have been a lot of think pieces about this. I mean, that was kind of what I was alluding to with the crisis of democracy, because I also think it's a crisis of the Democratic Party in terms of the failures to really reach and communicate and just really organize at a basic level. And I think there's a certain naivete. I think there's this U.S. exceptionalism that other countries have democratic backsliding and fall to authoritarianism, but somehow these problems don't happen to us. And I think we are realizing that we are just like any other country in the world and just as vulnerable.
Well, and I'll ask, I do think some people who have been reflecting back at what happened are actually saying the reason and the way that we got here is because we talked about identity politics, because we talked about racial justice and DEI. What's your comment to that critique?
I think it's how we talk about DEI and how we talk about racial justice. I think when we don't, I have had a lot of critiques of DEI when it's done badly. I don't like identity politics that are divorced from class and international politics and an analysis of class. The problem is whenever you take everything out. I think sometimes we've allowed capitalism and neoliberalism to co-opt identity politics so that it becomes like, oh, yay, girl boss. Goldman Sachs now has like a female CEO. And I just think that sometimes we've let capitalism infiltrate DEI in a way that has been really harmful and has really ignored the real pain that the vast majority of American working families are suffering right now. The Democratic policy agenda has missed the bold progressive policies that would really benefit people in a material way. Because I have found that people are very willing to embrace their neighbor, but we also need to be able to concretely improve people's lives as well.
Rhawa, do you have thoughts? I mean, I know you're going door to door now. There's some other things. I mean, what did we miss? Obviously, they used DEI, distilled it down to a very specific understanding that I think doesn't really embody what we're trying to do here.
If I'm being self-reflective, I think the many movements, right, but in particular, even in the climate movement, we kind of lost our way. That it became too much about top-down policy and not community organizing. And I think that people really weren't reading the tea leaves. We tried to signal during the first Trump administration that in our local community, there were about 6 alt-right groups. And within a year, we saw that expand to about 27. And when we did a little bit of digging and homework, how they were getting to these communities, these are also working class communities, mostly poor white communities that were left behind. And the right is very opportunistic. They actually use the left strategy around mutual aid and would go to these places and offer them mutual aid and listening ear. And then all of a sudden you've got these folks that are joining these groups, and you're having, around the holidays, a march of alt-right and KKK and Proud Boys going through one of our suburban towns that is primarily a working class white community. And so I think those were major failures. And then from, I think, the Democratic Party, if we're going to look at it from that arena, I think that, when I went door to door and getting ready for the election, what I heard from people is like, nobody ever comes to see them. The hardest hit communities, and these were Black and brown communities, these were white communities, but they were all low income and white communities in places like Erie, PA. And I remember going there thinking like, my gosh, you know what? You're right. You're right. And the conditions for those people are not changing, only to get worse if they do. And so I think those are the things that we've missed. So I think on the left, I don't think that we were doing enough organizing on the ground, really seeing the trends and meeting those people where they're at and actually organizing them through a power lens. So I just don't think that we had the kind of power that was needed to shift tides in a more permanent way. And we need to build greater social cohesion in community. That's what's going to help address the climate crisis in real ways. That's what's going to really build power in real ways. But also, as Khan said, like, how do we not see our neighbor as a stranger?
Yeah, can I add something to that, what Rhawa was saying? Because I really feel that a lot. And I think it's both and. I said we need to start materially benefiting people's lives and making sure that it's not just kind of identity politics. But I also want to say that I actually don't feel like as leaders or at least I'm going to speak a lot from the Democratic Party, because I do think there's a big important role the Democratic Party has to play as an opposition party in this moment. And one thing that I do think we've missed sometimes is moving beyond just self-interest, and as organizers, teaching people to connect the oppression that they're facing, perhaps as working class poor white folks in Erie, Pennsylvania, to the struggles of immigrants or queer folks or Black workers in Detroit. I think that has been something missing, I would say, from a lot of our movements.
Yeah, no, Con, you're talking about what we, I think, have been trying to do, which is to unite people, to build community, to build connectivity, which is really the opposite of what's happening now, which is that the division and the differences are driving us apart. And as a result, on your point, Rich, earlier, that is what facilitates the current power dynamic. So, Rich, let me ask you, all three of you have been longtime community organizers, parts of very, very successful campaigns. When you think about this moment broadly, do you think we should double down on the tactics we've been leveraging all these years, the community organizing, the other work? Or do you think it's time for us to try something different?
That's an interesting question. I think it's important to respond a little bit to the fact that there are lots of examples of multiracial working class organizing in our history as a country. In fact, some of the best organizing had critical examples of white workers standing up for Black workers standing up for white workers, farmers standing up for workers in the plants, vice versa. Solidarity is a critical tradition in our movement. It may be that the left or the progressive movement got too focused on our issues and less on the need to build multiracial power. I don't think a lot of us have thought as much about until recently is that we're still part of this project of trying to build a multiracial democracy. And I think a lot of folks will point out that we may never have actually had one, given the history of this country. And so that's something we still need to figure out how to build together. And my hope is that in a moment like this, people will see that, our strength will come from each other, and that we can turn the tide against autocracy and games of ego being driven out of the White House, and reset ourselves on a better future where folks are actually doing what they can to support each other and care about each other.
Yeah, the broad prosperity, the benefit that we would all share in a movement like that. So, Rhawa, as you know, there are many community groups that are in your shoes. We're ready, prepared to deploy federal dollars to improve communities, to support the health and well-being of communities and families and individuals. What advice would you give to a community group that has lost their funding? What's your plan? What are you doing in Buffalo to continue to advance access to clean energy?
This is a very surprising thing to say, but in some ways, I'm actually glad that funding went away. The requirements for what organizations have to do, at least for us, what we have to go through, you're tied to a lot of legalese and deliverables and timelines. Losing the funding has actually made us way more creative and getting down to the brass tacks. So we've decided that, we're not going to work in 20 neighborhoods this year. We're going to work in 5. We're actually going to be working in 6. And they show different parts of our community, all very needy, including 2 very white working class communities. We've got 2 that are primarily African American communities. We've got 1 that has high immigrant refugee population, Latino population, African American population, and old Italian immigrant population. We've got another one that's like Riverside. We're just getting to know them, so I'm not 100% sure because we haven't done the survey of who all lives there, but they're a very high need, forgotten about neighborhood. And so the idea is, we're going to do that deep level organizing, but I think organizing has to shift, and we have to do both, right? We have to both meet the material need of what people need right now and connect them to a power strategy. So this initial phase is collecting data and also getting the material change. We are recruiting community responders that are going to help their neighbors and get them to know each of their neighbors. So this is like not a one and done. We are going to be coming back over and over and over to build power with these people. Then the next phase is to actually introduce them to power organizing and restorative justice, but also that we're going to have them tour each other's neighborhoods, get to know each other, and how we can come in as a united block around the issues that are a through line across the entire city, right? And so that's going to take some time, but I'm so incredibly fulfilled to be doing this work. It's not easy, but the reception that we are receiving has been just absolutely incredible. There's just so much love, joy. We're building in the resilience, and we want to build an army of these people to, really, really take us. What is like birthing something new is what I like to call it, right? Because what we've been doing, we can't hold on to that, and that's no longer working clearly. So we need to be really thinking about different ways. And it's not like, forget everything in the past. Right? It's not an all or nothing. There's no zero-sum game here. It's about how do we incorporate the things that we know work, and then what are some new needs and new opportunities that we can really be planting seeds on.
What I love so much about working in the environmental justice community is that there's such resilience, and this is not the first time that communities have felt loss and attacks, and I love that you all keep going and keep figuring it out. We're going to have you back on the show to tell us how that's going. So, Rich, I wanted to get back to you on the ICE raids and all the attacks on immigrants. Folks are listening or seeing that all across the country. For allies in particular, what advice do you have for them?
I think it's really important to remember that what's at stake here is actually people's families and lives and principles of due process. The Supreme Court actually said racial profiling is okay in certain instances. People need to understand this is a time to stand up and resist and not cooperate. In this moment, people are really fighting hard to protect their communities. And they're folks that are standing up in just small ways all over the place. And I think you can't lose sight of that. It's kind of courage that we need everywhere. The immigration system is being used to finance a giant surveillance system. I think it's important to view what's happening through this power lens and to restate that we need to focus on building the power of communities and to resist giving this particular president any more power.
The fact that racial profiling is allowed should be frightening to all of us. As a Japanese American, I remind people that even being a U.S. citizen is no guarantee. Clearly, during World War II, many Japanese Americans, U.S. citizens, were wrongfully incarcerated, and that was under FDR, right? So there's a lot of, Khanh, on your point, testing of our democracy and what that stands for and what does that really mean. And I think there's so much for us to be very concerned about and tracking very closely. So, Khanh, you have this very important role as a state senator in Oregon. What can states be doing in this moment?
In this particular moment, I'm thinking about the need to build the broadest united front possible that includes labor, includes small businesses, community groups, faith groups, and elected leaders. And I think the two particular pillars, I would say, of that coalition that I'm emphasizing right now or thinking about are organized labor and our elected leaders. I think of organized labor because in this moment, when so many nonprofits are reeling from funding cuts, we're finding the fragility of our nonprofit industrial complex as well, that is incredibly dependent on federal funding and on philanthropy, which is hugely vulnerable. Labor is actually independent financially. They are truly grassroots and dependent on their members' dues. And of course, there's ways in which we could democratize labor more, and that's more important than ever to make sure that we are building strong labor community coalitions and relationships, because they're going to wedge us. Just as an example, the Trump administration's HR 1 does have terrible tax cuts that are going to cost billions of dollars in funding cuts for social services. But they've put in some things like no taxes on overtime pay. And some labor unions are not going to fight against the bigger bill because if it benefits some member, if we don't learn, that goes back to our learning how to connect our oppressions and not be narrowly about self-interest. Like, we've got to build stronger labor community coalitions to fight together against these devastating cuts. So I would say labor is one that I think is so important to be building with in this moment. And then, of course, our elected leaders, our Democratic Party needs absolute transformation. And I think for a lot of folks who come from marginalized communities have been taught, I know I was taught, I've internalized a lot of fear of power and elected power. I thought of it as very corrupting. And I was just afraid of it. When we're not used to seeing it wielded by people in our community, we think of it as just something maybe inherently corrupting or something that we can't hold. And I think we need to get over that fear and really learn how to engage with electoral power as part of a broader movement. But I would say getting involved, making sure we're taking over our local Democratic parties and running candidates that are truly grounded, accountable to communities and progressive in this moment and fight for the most marginalized communities in this moment. Those are two things that I would say states and communities can be doing to build our grassroots resilience in this moment.
Well, there's never enough time for us to cover all the things that we'd want to talk about. You all did an amazing job giving us the context that we need to set out on season 3 as we dig in even more. Thank you, Rhawa, Khanh, and Rich, for being with us today. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at Just Solutions Collective. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we're driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.